Foundation by Isaac Asimov. Part 1. The Psychohistorians. Hari Seldon, born in the 11,988th year of the Galactic Era, died 1269. The dates are more commonly given in terms of the current foundational era, as 79 to the year 1 FE. Born to middle-class parents on Helicon, Arcturus sector, where his father, in a legend of doubtful authenticity, was a tobacco grower in the hydroponic plants of the planet. He early showed amazing ability in mathematics. Anecdotes concerning his ability are innumerable, and some are contradictory. At the age of 2, he is said to have. Undoubtedly, his greatest contributions were in the field of psychohistory. Seldon found the field little more than a set of vague axioms. He left it a profound statistical science. The best existing authority we have for the details of his life is the biography written by Gall Dornick, who, as a young man, met Seldon 2 years before the great mathematician's death. The story of the meeting. Chapter 1. His name was Gall Dornick, and he was just a country boy who had never seen Trantor before. That is, not in real life. He had seen it many times on the hypervideo, and occasionally in tremendous three-dimensional newscasts, covering imperial coronation or the opening of a galactic council. Even though he had lived all his life on the world of Synax, which circled a star at the edges of the Blue Drift, he was not cut off from civilization, you see. At that time, no place in the galaxy was. There were nearly 25 million inhabited planets in the galaxy then, and not one but owed allegiance to the Empire, whose seat was on Trantor. It was the last half-century in which that could be said. To Gall, this trip was the undoubted climax of his young scholarly life. He had been in space before, so that the trip, as a voyage and nothing more, meant little to him. To be sure, he had traveled previously only as far as Synax's only satellite in order to get the data on the mechanics of meteor driftage, which he needed for his dissertation. But space travel was all one whether one traveled 500,000 miles or as many light years. He had steeled himself just a little for the jump through hyperspace, a phenomenon one did not experience in simple interplanetary trips. The jump remained, and would probably remain forever, the only practical method of traveling between the stars. Travel through ordinary space could proceed at no rate more rapid than that of ordinary light, a bit of scientific knowledge that belonged among the items known since the forgotten dawn of human history. And that would have meant many years of travel between even the nearest of inhabited systems. Through hyperspace, that unimaginable region that was neither space nor time, matter nor energy, something nor nothing, one could traverse the length of the galaxy in the interval between two neighboring instants of time. Gall had waited for the first of those jumps with a little dread curled gently in his stomach, and it ended in nothing more than a trifling jar, a little internal kick which ceased an instant before he could be sure he had felt it. That was all. And after that, there was only the ship, large and glistening, the cool production of 12,000 years of imperial progress, and himself, with his doctorate in mathematics freshly obtained and an invitation from the great Hari Seldon to come to Trantor and join the vast and somewhat mysterious Seldon project. What Gall was waiting for after the disappointment of the jump was the first sight of Trantor. He haunted the view room. The steel shutter lids were rolled back at announced times, and he was always there, watching the hard brilliance of the stars, enjoying the incredible hazy swarm of a star cluster, like a giant conglomeration of fireflies caught in mid-motion and stilled forever. At one time there was the cold, blue-white smoke of a gaseous nebula, within 5 light-years of the ship, spreading over the window like distant milk, filling the room with an icy tinge, and disappearing out of sight 2 hours later after another jump. The first sight of Trantor's sun was that of a hard white speck, all but lost in a myriad such, and recognizable only because it was pointed out by the ship's guide. The stars were thick here near the galactic center, but with each jump it shone more brightly, drowning out the rest, paling them and thinning them out. An officer came through and said, "View room will be closed for the remainder of the trip. Prepare for landing." Gall had followed after, clutching at the sleeve of the white uniform with the spaceship and sun of the Empire on it. He said, "Would it be possible to let me stay? I would like to see Trantor." The officer smiled, and Gall flushed a bit. It occurred to him that he spoke with a provincial accent. The officer said, "We'll be landing on Trantor by morning." "I mean, I want to see it from space." "Oh, sorry, my boy. If this were a space yacht, we might manage it. But we're spinning down, Sunside. You wouldn't want to be blinded, burnt, radiation scarred all at the same time, would you? Gall started to walk away. The officer called after him. Traintor would only be a gray blur anyway, kid. Why don't you take a space tour once you hit Traintor? They're cheap. Gall looked back. Thank you very much. It was childish to feel disappointed, but childishness comes almost as naturally to a man as to a child, and there was a lump in Gall's throat. He had never seen Traintor spread out in all its incredibility, as large as life, and he hadn't expected to have to wait longer. Chapter 2. The ship landed in a medley of noises. There was the far-off hiss of the atmosphere cutting and sliding past the metal of the ship. There was the steady drone of conditioners fighting the heat of friction, and the slower rumble of the engines, enforcing deceleration. There was the human sound of men and women gathering in the debarkation rooms, and the grind of the hoists lifting baggage, mail, and freight to the long axis of the ship, from which they would be later moved along to the unloading platform. Gall felt the slight jar that indicated the ship no longer had an independent motion of its own. Ship's gravity had been giving way to planetary gravity for hours. Thousands of passengers had been sitting patiently in the debarkation rooms, which swung easily on yielding force fields to accommodate its orientation to the changing direction of the gravitational forces. Now they were crawling down curving ramps to the large, yawning locks. Gall's baggage was minor. He stood at a desk, as it was quickly and expertly taken apart and put together again. His visa was inspected and stamped. He himself paid no attention. This was Traintor. The air seemed a little thicker here, the gravity a bit greater than on his home planet of Synax, but he would get used to that. He wondered if he would get used to immensity. Debarkation building was tremendous. The roof was almost lost in the heights. Gall could almost imagine that clouds could form beneath its immensity. He could see no opposite wall, just men and desks and converging floor till it faded out in haze. The man at the desk was speaking again. He sounded annoyed. He said, "Move on, Dornick." He had to open the visa, look again before he remembered the name. Gall said, Where? The man at the desk jerked a thumb. "Taxis to the right and third left." Gall moved, seeing the glowing twists of air suspended high in the nothingness and reading, "Taxis to all points." A figure detached itself from anonymity and stopped at the desk as Gall left. The man at the desk looked up and nodded briefly. The figure nodded in return and followed the young immigrant. He was in time to hear Gall's destination. Gall found himself hard against a railing. A small sign said, "Supervisor." The man to whom the sign referred did not look up. He said, "Where to?" Gall wasn't sure, but even a few seconds' hesitation meant men queuing in line behind him. The supervisor looked up. Where to? Gall's funds were low. There was only this one night, and then he would have a job. He tried to sound nonchalant. "A good hotel, please." Supervisor was unimpressed. "They're all good. Name one." Gall said desperately, "The nearest one, please." Supervisor touched a button. A thin line of light formed along the door, twisting among others which brightened and dimmed in different colors and shades. A ticket was shoved into Gall's hands. It glowed faintly. The supervisor said, 1.12. Gall fumbled for the coins. He said, "Where do I go?" "Follow the light. The ticket will keep glowing as long as you're pointed in the right direction." Gall looked up and began walking. There were hundreds creeping across the vast floor, following their individual trails, sifting and straining themselves through intersection points to arrive at their respective destinations. His own trail ended. A man in glaring blue and yellow uniform, shining in new and unsustainable plastotextile, reached for his 2 bags. "Direct line to the Luxor," he said. The man who followed Gall heard that. He also heard Gall say, "Fine," and watched him enter the blunt-nosed vehicle. The taxi lifted straight up. Gall stared out the curved, transparent window, marveling at the sensation of air flight within an enclosed structure, and clutching instinctively at the back of the driver's seat. The vastness contracted, and the people became ants in random distribution. The scene contracted further and began to slide backward. There was a wall ahead. It began high in the air and extended upward out of sight. It was riddled with holes that were mouths of tunnels. Gall's taxi moved toward one, then plunged into it. For a moment, Gall wondered idly how his driver could pick out one among so many. There was now only blackness, with nothing but the past flashing of a colored signal light to relieve the gloom. The air was full of a rushing sound. Gall leaned forward against deceleration then the taxi popped out of the tunnel and descended to ground level once more. "The Luxor Hotel," said the driver unnecessarily. He helped Gall with his baggage, accepted a 10th credit tip with a business-like air, picked up a waiting passenger, and was rising again. In all this, from the moment of debarkation, there had been no glimpse of sky. Trantor. At the beginning of the 13th millennium, this tendency reached its climax. As the center of the imperial government for unbroken hundreds of generations and located, as it was, toward the central regions of the galaxy, among the most densely populated and industrially advanced worlds of the system, it could scarcely help being the densest and richest clod of humanity the race had ever seen. Its urbanization, progressing steadily, had finally reached the ultimate. All the land surface of Trantor, 75 million square miles in extent, was a single city. The population, at its height, was well in excess of 40 billions. This enormous population was devoted almost entirely to the administrative necessities of empire, and found themselves all too few for the complications of the task. It is to be remembered that the impossibility of proper administration of the Galactic Empire under the uninspired leadership of the late emperors was a considerable factor in the fall. Daily, fleets of ships in the tens of thousands brought the produce of 20 agricultural worlds to the dinner tables of Trantor. Its dependence upon the outer worlds for food and, indeed, for all necessities of life made Trantor increasingly vulnerable to conquest by siege. In the last millennium of the Empire, the monotonously numerous revolts made emperor after emperor conscious of this, and imperial policy became little more than the protection of Trantor's delicate jugular vein. Chapter 3. Gall was not certain whether the sun shone, or for that matter, whether it was day or night. He was ashamed to ask. All the planets seemed to live beneath metal. The meal of which he had just partaken had been labeled luncheon, but there were many planets which lived on a standard timescale that took no account of the perhaps inconvenient alternation of day and night. The rate of planetary turnings differed, and he did not know that of Trantor. At first, he had eagerly followed the signs to the sunroom, and found it but a chamber for basking in artificial radiation. He lingered a moment or two, then returned to the Luxor's main lobby. He said to the room clerk, "Where can I buy a ticket for planetary tour?" "Right here." "When will it start?" "You just missed it." "Another one tomorrow." "Buy a ticket now and we'll reserve a place for you." "Oh." Tomorrow would be too late. He would have to be at the university tomorrow. He said, "There wouldn't be an observation tower or something. I mean in the open air." "Sure. Sell you a ticket for that if you want. Better let me check if it's raining or not." He closed a contact at his elbow and read the flowing letters that raced across the frosted screen. Gall read with him. The room clerk said, "Good weather. Come to think of it, I do believe it's the dry season now." He added conversationally, "I don't bother with the outside myself. The last time I was in the open was 3 years ago. You see it once, and that's all there is to it. Here's your ticket. Special elevator in the rear. It's marked, 'To the Tower.' Just take it." The elevator was of the new sort that ran by gravitic repulsion. Gall entered and others flowed in behind him. The operator closed a contact. For a moment, Gall felt suspended in space as gravity switched to zero. Then he had weight again in small measure as the elevator accelerated upward. Deceleration followed and his feet left the floor. He squawked against his will. The operator called out, "Tuck your feet under the railing. Can't you read the sign?" The others had done so. They were smiling at him as he madly and vainly tried to clamber back down the wall. Their shoes pressed upward against the chromium of the railings that stretched across the floor in parallels set 2 feet apart. He had noticed those railings on entering and had ignored them. Then a hand reached out and pulled him down. He gasped his thanks as the elevator came to a halt. He stepped out upon an open terrace bathed in a white brilliance that hurt his eyes. The man, whose helping hand he had just now been the recipient of, was immediately behind him. The man said kindly, "Plenty of seats." Gall closed his mouth. He had been gaping and said, "It certainly seems so." He started for them automatically, then stopped. He said, "If you don't mind, I'll just stop a moment at the railing. I want to look a bit." The man waved him on good-naturedly, and Gall leaned out over the shoulder-high railing and bathed himself in all the panorama. He could not see the ground. It was lost in the ever-increasing complexities of man-made structures. He could see no horizon other than that of metal against sky, stretching out to almost uniform grayness, and he knew it was so over all land surface of the planet. There was scarcely any motion to be seen. A few pleasure craft lays against the sky, but all the busy traffic of billions of men were going on, he knew, beneath the metal skin of the world. There was no green to be seen, no green, no soil, no life other than man. Somewhere in the world, he realized vaguely, was the Emperor's palace, set amid 100 square miles of natural soil, green with trees, rainbowed with flowers. It was a small island amid an ocean of steel, but it wasn't visible from where he stood. It might be 10,000 miles away. He did not know. Before very long, he must have his tour. He sighed noisily and realized finally that he was on Trantor at last, on the planet which was the center of the galaxy and the kernel of the human race. He saw none of its weaknesses. He saw no ships of food landing. He was not aware of a jugular vein delicately connecting the 40 billion of Trantor with the rest of the galaxy. He was conscious only of the mightiest deed of man, the complete and almost contemptuously final conquest of a world. He came away a little blank-eyed. His friend of the elevator was indicating a seat next to him, and Gal took it. The man smiled. "My name is Gerald. First time on Trantor?" "Yes, Mr. Gerald." "Thought so. Gerald's my first name. Trantor gets you if you've got the poetic temperament. Trantorians never come up here, though. They don't like it. Gives them nerves." "Nerves? My name's Gall, by the way. Why should it give them nerves? It's glorious." "Subjective matter of opinion, Gall. If you're born in a cubicle and grow up in a corridor and work in a cell and vacation in a crowded sunroom, then coming up into the open with nothing but sky over you might just give you a nervous breakdown. They make the children come up here once a year after they're 5. I don't know if it does any good. They don't get enough of it, really, and the first few times they scream themselves into hysteria. They ought to start as soon as they're weaned and have the trip once a week." He went on. "Of course, it doesn't really matter. What if they never come out at all? They're happy down there, and they run the Empire. How high up do you think we are?" He said, "Half a mile?" and wondered if that sounded naive. It must have, for Gerald chuckled a little. He said, "No, just 500 feet." "What? But the elevator took about—" "I know. But most of the time it was just getting up to ground level. Trantor is tunneled over a mile down. It's like an iceberg. 9/10 of it is out of sight. Even works itself out a few miles into the sub-ocean soil at the shorelines. In fact, we're down so low that we can make use of the temperature difference between ground level and a couple miles under to supply us with all the energy we need. Did you know that?" "No, I thought you used atomic generators." "Did once, but this is cheaper." "I imagine so. What do you think of it all?" For a moment, the man's good nature evaporated into shrewdness. He almost looked sly. Gal fumbled. "Glorious," he said again. "Here on vacation? Traveling? Sightseeing?" "Not exactly. At least, I've always wanted to visit Trantor, but I came here primarily for a job." "Well?" Gal felt obliged to explain further. "With Dr. Selden's project at the University of Trantor." "Raven Selden?" "Why, no. The one I mean is Harry Selden, the psychohistorian Selden. I don't know of any Raven Selden." "Harry's the one I mean. They call him Raven. Slang, you know. He keeps predicting disaster." "He does?" Gal was genuinely astonished. "Surely you must know." Gerald was not smiling. "You're coming to work for him, aren't you?" "Well, yes. I'm a mathematician. Why does he predict disaster? What kind of disaster?" "What kind would you think?" "I'm afraid I wouldn't have the least idea. I've read the papers Dr. Selden and his group have published. They're on mathematical theory." "Yes, the ones they publish." Gal felt annoyed. He said, "I think I'll go to my room now. Very pleased to have met you." Gerald waved his arm indifferently in farewell. Gal found a man waiting for him in his room. For a moment he was too startled to put into words the inevitable, "What are you doing here?" that came to his lips. The man rose. He was old and almost bald, and he walked with a limp, but his eyes were very bright and blue. He said, "I am Harry Selden." An instant before Gall's befuddled brain placed the face alongside the memory of the many times he had seen it in pictures.